Hello, and welcome to the Game Development Podcast by Dark Paradigm Games. We're making a series of podcasts on important game development topics that we think will be useful for you. We've learned a lot from starting up an indie game development studio, so stay tuned for the whole series to learn our successes and mistakes. I am your host, Edwin Deiser, and I'm here today with
Jacqueline Martin. I'm creative director and co-founder of Dark Paradigm Games.
And we have some wonderful guests with us today who together form Sinusaur, which is a sound design and music and general sound production team. Perhaps you can explain better, Bas and Nathan.
Yeah, I'm Bas Bertrand, and I'm one of the guys from Sinusaur. With Sinusaur, we were three guys, and what we try to do is that we take care of the whole audio process within games. So we take care of the composition, the sound design, and the technical sound design, which includes the implementation in the middleware and game engine. And with that, we try to get a more coherent sound in the games.
Oh, that sounds exciting. Maybe you can both introduce yourself a little, like what you do. Nathan told me that you both have different roles, but yeah, maybe Nathan, introduce yourself. Who are you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Nathan, or Nathan if you want to use my Dutch name. I'm a composer, voiceover producer, and technical sound designer for games. I've studied at the HKU University of the Arts Utrecht for music and technology, and I'm following a master's there as well right now, where I'm delving into game audio more and really specializing in there. And on the side, I'm a metal artist. It influences my music a lot, so I thought I'd mention it.
Yeah.
What's your instrument, out of curiosity?
I play guitar, mainly. I also dabble in some bass and keyboard. But the main thing is guitar.
And how about you, Bas?
So I'm also a Dutch guy, also based in Utrecht. I'm Bas Bertrand. I also graduated music and technology at the School of Arts. That's where I also know Nathan from, in 2019. And I'm a composer and sound designer for games and film. But I also do projects in theater, for example. So I'm quite broad orientated, even though my focus nowadays is more on games.
Yeah, and I think I would say that's quite a common trend among general composers these days. Would you agree that people generally have quite broad skill bases now?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's true. I think it also has to do with that it's sound can be, formed into different how you say that in English? Into different mediums, even with the same skill set. Even though you have, for example, specific skills for each medium, you can apply it into different mediums.
That's actually something that I found very interesting because I have absolutely no knowledge about sound design or music design. But I come from that creative side where I do understand what works together. And I was wondering how, for example, music for film differs from music for games, or is there something that makes it very different to compose for one or the other?
Well, there's one big factor, and that's that films are set in stone. Like there's this point where you go from A to B, and that's it. So you always know what's about to happen. You always know what's gonna happen. So you can make music for that very easily. Or well, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's kind of let me phrase it like this: the tough part about music for games is that it has to sound good everywhere, and the player can do anything. So you have to be prepared with the music, with some kind of system to have it, play the right mood and play the right emotions or invoke the right emotions at the right times. And that can get quite tricky to time that right. And music-wise, I'd say that's the big difference.
Yeah, no two playthroughs of a game are going to be the same. So you can't have a piece that lasts
Exactly.
1 minute in a particular section because the next person who plays it might take 2 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, actually, this is the composition is also made by the player itself in a way, because it reacts on his actions. And that makes it really interesting for me, at least. It makes it really interesting that it's actually a representation. If it's a really good soundtrack, for a really good interactive soundtrack, then it is a representation for somebody's gameplay. And I think that's really interesting about game music and game audio.
That would mean that just by playing a game, if you have, for example, I'm just throwing it out, adaptive music or something, then the player itself, in your opinion, becomes some sort of composer?
In a way, I mean, the gameplay itself, how somebody plays a game, and it really depends on the kind of game, of course. You have huge differences in this, of course. But in a way, the player is making the score.
Yeah. There are, of course, some games where that's very at the forefront of the game. This is going back a while, but I think it was a PS2 game called Flow, which you control. You basically just control a graphic, I think, and the way you move it controls the music.
I think it was composed by Austin Wintory, who also composed Apsu and Journey. If I'm right.
Yeah.
Wow.
I could be mistaken, but I think it is also, and he's amazing. But yeah, that's a good example of this.
Probably the most extreme it gets, but yeah, it's a nice point. I think we'll delve into that more later. But first of all, I just wanted to ask you some quite general questions, especially because on your website, Bas, you mention mad professor-like experiments.
We stalked a little.
When you're composing. And I just had to find out more about that and your creative process.
Yeah. Well, it's actually an interesting thing because it. I wrote this line of text, I think, about a year ago, when I was actually still on the School of Arts studying. And back then, all my process, and now as well, all my processes consist of a lot of experimentation and a lot of darlings being killed. And that's what I mean by mad-like experiments. It's like I take a sound and I deform it until it's actually what I want it to be. And then often you don't even hear what it was before. You know, I can take a bite of an apple and make a whole soundscape of it, and that's what I really like. But it sounds there is some kind of structure in this. I know that if I grind on this sound for, let's say, a day, then it becomes something which I haven't had in mind in the first place, even though I had to do a lot of sound experience.
Wow. Yeah, Nathan, are you also experiencing it similar, or is sound creation or music creation completely different for you?
I think there's similarities. For me, like, I don't do a lot of sound design. That's more Bas's forte, I'd say. But with music, usually I start with an idea or a story, and from that, I just improvise, and I just, I check what it's become after I'm done improvising and trying stuff. And then, if I don't like it, I'll just go deform it as well. I'll just, try to absolutely make a monstrosity out of it to see if anything comes from it. And if it doesn't, I just, I just shove it aside and start another piece and do the same. And I just, I check what is best at the end of the day, and then I'll use that, or I'll try again another day, and but it's kind of the same approach.
I see. I already have another question. Because you said, because you said Bas does more of the sound design, and I don't really know what you do different now, because I have absolutely no clue.
Okay, what you mean? What's the difference between what Nathan does and what I do?
So you do sound design, and Nathan also does sound design, but different.
Okay. I totally get the confusion here, because, and this is actually really common in in both game and film and theater, if you talk about sound and different, I said a different way to describe what you do, then it's always really confusing. I think the biggest difference is that between if you work as a composer, then you create the soundtrack of a game or of a film. So you create all the the music for the game and make it interactive. If you do the sound design, then you focus on all the sounds which represent the world where we, as a player, are in that game. So, for example, that can be all the sounds of the surroundings of the forest, but also the sounds of all the mechanics of the machines in the game, for example. And then there's something different about being a technical sound designer. Maybe I think you can explain that better, Nathan.
Yeah. So the difference between sound design and technical sound design, which is another term, is that a technical sound designer is really more of a link between the programmer and the sound department when you're talking about game development. And a technical sound designer is the one that makes sure that sounds get implemented into the game right, and the music gets implemented into the game right. And from there, he can also do a lot of tweaking with, like, if you have a certain sound, let's say a footstep, then you can randomize the way it's played back. You can increase the pitch a little or increase the length of the file a little, but that's all usually done in the in middleware that you use to implement the sound into games. So the technical sound designer also has a big role in how the game ends up sounding. So that's another term to describe people making sound for games.
So for the game devs out there who maybe want to do some solo audio work, what middleware would you generally be using?
I think mainly Fmod, and there's like two big middleware programs right now, and that's Fmod and Wise. But Wise is for people with a bigger budget. So with Fmod, you can actually do one free project a year, if I'm not mistaken. So you don't have to pay for using that if you're a smaller team starting out, or if you're a solo person starting out and you want to publish your project, then you won't need to pay for Fmod as long as you keep your revenue and your budget for that project under a certain amount.
I think it's $500,000 even if you are under the $500,000 on budget, development budget, then it's free to use.
So,
which is quite a lot.
Don't be too successful.
Otherwise you pay.
So what would you recommend, like, because now I learned, okay, there's a technical artist, there's a composer, and there's a sound effect person. So let's imagine I'm having a huge company, studio, whatever, and how would my sound department look like? What types of people would I hire? And then the other question, let's imagine I'm a really small indie game studio. What would be the person I would need?
Okay, so you're talking about the difference also between a big AAA studio and that sound department?
For me, I just wonder because I know that you, for example, in art need a concept artist, you need a technical artist. I know the roles there, but I don't know what type of jobs you would have in the sound industry. Also, would you even have in-house sound, or is that something that you would completely outsource?
You absolutely would have some. It depends. If you're a big studio, my reference right now is like Guerrilla Games is the biggest game studio in the Netherlands. And I know that there's a lot of people there for the sound department. A lot of sound designers mainly, and also an audio programmer. So that's a person who basically writes all kinds of scripts for audio programs, because they don't use standard tools to implement everything, if I'm right. So they need custom programming for audio, so they have a special person for that. And they also have people that concern themselves with voiceover. So they do a lot of flying over to LA to record people, and then editing everything together, making sure the dialogue's right with what's said by the actors. And then there's also some kind of a creative director for sound. So their sound department is pretty huge. But even then, the music specifically, they outsource. So even with that big of a company, they do outsource things.
And I think also there's a reason for this, that they outsource the music and not the sound design. Because I think when the soundtrack is being made and a lot of people are working on the soundtrack, then you don't get a really coherent soundtrack,
No.
So a soundtrack has to be often coming from one or a few persons, or at least one composer, who oversees the whole process. And where with sound design, you can, if you have a really big game, you can say, okay, you make all the sounds for this robot character, for example, in the game, and you make all the sounds for the forest. So then people can focus on specific parts and of course they have to pay attention that it all fits well together. But that's way easier to spread out over more people, I think, compared to music.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think Blizzard may have some in-house composers. I've seen that post being advertised, but I've only seen it in just the very biggest game companies that I've seen. And I think they may want an in-house composer because they want somebody on salary, because games like World of Warcraft are constantly being added to and changing. So in fact, that's almost a way of keeping the sound consistent across the whole game. They just keep the same guy on salary who can then write music for expansions.
Wow. Yeah, we already dove completely into the topic because, why not? But how did you two actually get into sound design, music? What is your inspiration?
Well, I think I have to dig deep though. Well, for me, it's just I've always been busy with music and sound. Like from the moment I was able to buy a Game Boy Color, I nonstop played Pokemon, and from there on I started playing guitar. And at some point I was just like trying to combine what I liked in life most. So it kind of led me to doing audio for games. It's kind of natural for me because I've been doing stuff that that has to do with games and music since I was a child. So I guess that's it. Not really a deep answer, but or did you mean more like how did you get into the industry and doing things?
I mean, that was a perfectly fine answer, but you can also answer that while you're at it.
I suppose. Yeah, so well, basically I was doing a study in IT and it wasn't really my thing, and I was desperately looking for something to combine it. But the HKU is the only school in the Netherlands that actually has some focus on game audio or interactive music, like at all. There's not a lot of places for it. So from there, I got into contact with a lot of game devs and people who do it passionately, because they also have an entire game development school. So from there, I started doing projects and kind of developing my own vision of what music and audio and games should be. And now we're here with Sinusaur. It's kind of hard to summarize the entire history of doing the things you do. but yeah,
of course.
So, boss, can you summarize the entire history of how you got here and why you're in sound?
3 words. Go.
No, I can tell. Well, actually, it started really funny. My whole music game journey. I went in a lot of different directions, but it started all when I was, I think, about 10 years old. I told my parents, like, "Mom, Dad, I want to play saxophone." And they didn't play any instruments. They don't know about anything, and they thought, like, yeah, if you want to learn an instrument, the first thing you play is the flute. So they said, okay, boy, here you have a flute and go and play. So there I was as a 10-year-old boy. I wanted to play this nice instrument, the saxophone, in class for the flute, which I hated. So after 1 year, I told my parents, Mom, Dad, I hate music. I never want to make music again. So that's how my music career started. So 2 years later, we were somewhere, I think in the south of Holland, with friends of my parents. And one of those people, they brought a guitar with them. And I was obsessed from the first moment. I was just playing the whole day in that weekend. And after that, I didn't have any guitar, but my parents were also like, yeah, we don't want to buy you a guitar because, the last thing, the flute, you also threw that away. So I got a hand on the guitar of a friend of mine, but it only had 3 strings. So I played for, I think 6 months on the guitar with 3 strings, a lot, the whole day. And after that, my parents are like, okay. This guy, he's serious about this, so we buy him a guitar.
You weren't the other 2 strings.
No. I mean, the whole guitar. It was that's why somebody gave it to me. It was a mess. So then I went and bought my first guitar, and a month later I got into my first band, and I kept on playing in bands for years actually. And until after high school, I took a gap year, and I really wanted to go to the conservatory actually to play guitar and to become a jazz musician. I played a lot of jazz in that period. So I went away for a year, learned to play sitar actually, the Indian instrument, and came back, and I was like, nope, I'm not going to go to the conservatory. I want to do something more broad and more challenging. So I went to the School of Arts, and they accepted me. And from there on, I went there with the idea that I wanted to become a film composer. But when I got there, I focused first on sound art. So I made this crazy interactive sound installations. And that's where my whole interest for interactive sounds started. So I made a lot of art installations, sound art installations. And after that, I came back to film and made music for films again. And that's when actually I thought like, yeah, okay, I can make the interactive music. I can make music for the films, and I love playing games now. So this is meant to be.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how the whole journey ended there. And nowadays my main focus is on games.
It's interesting that for a lot of people in game sound, they've kind of found their way there haphazardly. I think probably as a career, it just wasn't taken that seriously maybe 10, 20 years ago, when a lot of us were growing up. So perhaps there was a moment for a lot of people where they just thought, actually, why not combine my 2 interests of music and games and get into game audio?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really interesting one, because I think it's also not really long ago that music for games made a huge development or huge step, because there was basically more processing power available for music. So where like 20, 30 years ago, you were really limited by the processing power and how you could make music for games. Nowadays, you still have to keep that in mind, but it's, the possibilities are endless. And it's also way more intuitive to make music for games these days, I think.
And I think there's much less of a barrier to entry, because provided you have an okay computer or laptop and maybe $20 to spare, you could make a best-selling hit with that, to be honest. There's no reason why you need to spend many thousands on the best equipment. I mean, there are certain styles like orchestral music where I actually do think you need to spend that money. But, for most areas, it's there's a very low barrier of entry. I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, and even for orchestral music, I mean, I think Nathan can tell you more about that. You can get really close just with software to getting an orchestral sound. You don't need an orchestra for that, even though, if you want to take it to the next level, you can take an orchestra for that. But Nathan is doing that more, making orchestral music just with software.
Yeah.
It's interesting how that's actually made, that software as well.
Yeah. Well, like you said, there might be some kind of barrier, like the money for certain plugins and software. But there's different categories of orchestral sounds, I'd say. Like with a lot of old synthesizer sounds, you can actually come very close to making a good sounding orchestra game soundtrack. The old modular or the old analog synths do a good job at it. And there's a lot of free to use plugins for DAWs. Maybe we should say what DAWs are.
Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, it's basically digital audio workstations. Like you said Audacity earlier in our conversation, or Reaper, Pro Tools, Logic. The programs that you use to make your music sound effects with.
Windows Sound Player.
That's just
who doesn't know Windows Sound Player?
I mean, it's even called like that.
Yeah, but getting back on topic, it's actually, you can make pretty good sounding orchestral-like soundtracks. And that's the first level is synthesized orchestral sounds. But you also have a lot of plugins where you can just control an entire orchestra with your MIDI controller. We should also elaborate on the MIDI controller, probably.
Yeah, what's that?
It's in most cases it's a keyboard like a piano, and every note you press is basically assigned to a MIDI value. So if you press the middle note, the C, then you send a MIDI note, and that MIDI note translates in a program to a music note, a C. So if you play a C on your MIDI controller, you're gonna hear the violin play a note in C, for example.
And you do that through sound libraries. This is a mystical word for me because I don't really know what this entails. But for example, in art, you have brushes, for example, for Photoshop, and you use different brushes to achieve different things. Can I assume that a sound library would be similar, or what it is it exactly?
You could compare the two. Like a brush is a different texture. A sound library gives you a different sound, a different instrument. I'd say they're very comparable.
So you have a library of different instruments you can each use through your MIDI thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Got it.
Yeah, and with the MIDI, you control what notes the library produces. That's basically how it works.
Cool.
So with that, you can control an entire orchestra just by having a keyboard or a MIDI controller, piano, and a couple of plugins. So that's also a way to get a cool orchestral soundtrack. That comes really close to sounding like a real thing. And the next layer is obviously writing sheet music for an entire orchestra and then having it recorded. Might be a tad expensive, but yeah, there's a lot of ways to go about making orchestral-like soundtracks. So there's some barriers to some levels, but you can always just try making it with synthesized sounds to get started.
Yeah, you can also combine those two, I know, for example, in I think it was actually in Pirates of the Caribbean, the movie. There, the half of the music was written as, computer orchestral music, and the other half, to save money, I guess, was played in by a part of the orchestra. And by combining those two, they could make, you know, a really nice orchestral soundtrack. Which was part electronic, part real humans.
That's really cool. Wow.
I think that's a fairly common approach these days, especially if you've got a soloist or there's just an instrument that's particularly important in whatever music you're writing. If the studio has a bit of budget, this could cost anywhere between, I don't know, $50 if you've just got a friend who can do it for you, and probably $1,000 or maybe $2,000 if you want somebody who's quite well known to do it. But you can just send the sounds you want to a professional musician. They could be on the other side of the world. Then they send you back a recording of just that thing. And because it's very important, because the listeners are very focused on it, then that bit where most of the attention is lying gets the best sounds possible. Because the software, it can come really close to sounding real, but it's still not perfect yet. So you'll get the best results from a live musician.
Exactly. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think that's just in general really important with just with music in general, that you know, music is a representation most often of a certain feeling or an atmosphere. It always comes down to feeling, and it's way more ungrabbable compared to other elements. For example, visual elements, which people are easier to, you know, they can grasp it. But music is some like this driving energy behind a medium, which people experience, but they cannot wrap their head around, you know? So it's like a driving force behind it, which makes it really subtle and really important that it's, you know, emotional in a way, and that the humans are involved with this, of course, like all the other things. But I think you're really right about that, Edwin. That's it's really important that you give this musical feeling.
Yeah, that makes me wonder, where would you two see the future of sound design in general for the game industry? Because I think in a lot of different aspects, I think audio is not underappreciated maybe, but I think there's so much more room for it to grow.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
The future of the audio in games, you know, it's a big one.
Yeah.
But either way, I think what you're saying is right. It might be underappreciated because a lot of things right now is like just putting a loop under something or just making a simple soundtrack that repeats. That some games do that and it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And not everyone is aware of the fact that it can be something more yet. And probably as we go on, and there's a lot of more interesting interactive soundtracks, and it becomes more common, it might become more interactive, and it might become more focused on the entire experience. So that maybe sound and music becomes a more integrated part of a game development team, because right now it's usually outsourced and it's usually done at the end instead of a sound designer or a composer being an integral part of a game development team.
I think what you already see, another huge part in this is just basically processing power, about what is possible with the resources we have now, is that we most often just we compose music, we make it interactive, but it's still audio we play. And this is a little bit hard to explain, but if it's, you know, I think eventually it will be possible within games to generate the audio instead of making interactive music by playing audio. Do you know a little bit what I mean with this?
Yeah, that would be fantastic if you could host your instrument inside the game. So the game becomes almost like the door.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, and I would love that to happen.
I think.
Yeah. I mean, me too.
Maybe more musicians or sound designers need to actively step into the role of game design to make these things happen. Because, small anecdote, I was at a game jam that's like almost a year ago, And there was also one sound designer, and he made an amazing small game in the span of 8 hours, which was basically geared towards blind people or people that could not see a full spectrum. And it was a VR experience, and you could walk in the room depending on where you heard sounds. And it was basically a puzzle game. And I find that super interesting because it's opening up so much more also for people that cannot see and cannot play normal games on a monitor.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I think that there are certain games which are played by blind people just because the sounds are just so good and so detailed, that you can play a game just without actually seeing the game. And some games I cannot really, it doesn't pop in my head which game this was, but there are some games which even blind people can play because of the good sound design.
There was a black and white game on virtual reality. I saw it on the Oculus store. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name, but I think it'll probably be out by now, which again there are some visuals, but I think you play as a blind person. And a lot of it's to do with virtual reality has some quite good sound spatialization, which is basically being able to hear exactly where a sound came from, exactly where it's pinpointed. So with this game, although there is a visual cue about where sounds come from, I think the main point is that a blind person perhaps could play it because they know exactly where everything is just by the sounds they're making.
That's cool. That brings me to the next question. What inspires you artistically? Like what type of games or a specific game even?
Well, I can start with this one. For me, one of the biggest inspirations is, I think, just in general, the composer Austin Wintory. This is for the music, and because he makes for Journey and Apsu, and he made wonderful interactive soundtracks. And actually, to a point where if I'm playing it, I'm like, wow, how did you even do this?
What was his name again? Can you repeat it?
Austin Wintory.
Okay.
He made the music for Journey and Apsu. And what I really liked also about, for example, Journey, is that it was, I think, a game funded by Sony, and they were just like going back and forth between the development part and the composer, and he played a really big role in how the game eventually came to be, because he was really involved in the whole game. In the whole game development and the whole process. So they every time he sent I saw an interview where he told that every time he sent like a new piece of music for the game, and then the people from the development part were like, yeah, but this is so good. Now we're going to make the game even better, and they changed the game, sent it back, and he was like, yeah, but come on, I need to make something different for this. And this was going on for 3 years until Sony said like, okay, guys, it's enough. And for me, it's actually a wonderful piece of art. The whole game, this is one of the most inspirational games for me. But there are many other things which are inspirational beside games, I have to say.
Yeah.
But for Nathan, what's for you?
My inspirations, I think I'm more of like you like a lot of artsy indie games, which are like beautiful soundtracks, interactive stuff. I think I'm more of a thrill seeker. I like adrenaline. So stuff that inspires me is like Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Like those soundtracks are so epic, and when they come in, it gives you a lot of like emotion, and it's so overwhelming, and it fits into the design so well. And part of that is also because they use a lot of silence in their games. There's almost no soundtracks going on except for when you fight a boss. And that makes, when the music kicks in, like it makes it so much more impactful. That's a pretty big thing that influences me. Like use of silence is pretty important, and to be aware of that makes your music more impactful. Like the use of silence is was well really important. And for music itself, I like a lot of orchestral stuff, like Final Fantasy. Well, Dark Souls, obviously, they do that as well. But also the more old school-ish sounds that, well, Pokemon used, and a lot of Game Boy Color games, really. And yeah, except for that, I have my own metal side as well. so there's a lot of stuff that it kind of inspires me and makes me able to go on. And luckily, it's kind of diverse, so I always have something to draw from. So yeah, it's a combination of all that.
Yeah, leading on from that, do you ever get creative blocks, and if so, how do you work your way around those?
Well, I've had one a couple of years ago. It was kind of my last one since then.
Oh wow.
Yeah, well, I found a way, I guess. But nah, but I had to compose something for a string quartet, and I don't know what it caused, but I just wasn't able to do it. But I think that it was because I wasn't very aware of my process that I go through when I make something. And to alleviate it, my teacher was like, okay, in order to, get rid of that creative block, we're going to get you to write down, or get you to try a lot of different processes and write them down or remember them, and see how that goes. So from there on, I tried like at least 10 different methods of making music, and I documented everything.
Wow.
And since then, like, whenever I'm not feeling one certain approach, I always have another approach to try. And when I try all those 10 approaches, there's usually something that comes out of it. And even if that something is not something that is final, I have something that I can transform into new material and go on from there. And, when it's another day and I've tried those 10 things and even the transforming doesn't work, I can just try it again another day, another mood, another setting. So there's just so many ways to make material that it's kind of hard for me to get a art block now. But it really boils down to being very aware of what the processes can be for you.
That sounds super amazing. Like, can you maybe elaborate a little on these different processes? Because, I mean, there are also a lot of other creative people. For example, in art, a creative block is also very well known. I personally never had a creative block, so maybe I'm just lucky in that. But
you are.
I would really like to know what your approaches are, or maybe where you can compare these to other creative jobs.
I think there's some comparable things. If I looked at myself, like there's I usually try improvising to make something. It's my go-to strategy. It's what comes easiest. So I just take in what needs to be done. So I'm like, okay, a game that's I don't know, dark fantasy and medieval. I'll just say something, and then I try to take in the mood. Maybe look at some art or mood boards, and then just make music for whatever section I know there needs to be music for. And that's one of the approaches. But you could also be more strategic about it and be like, okay, it's dark fantasy and medieval. So what instruments did they use in those times, in medieval times? And then try and see if you can find something that inspires you there. So maybe do a more historic approach. You can also look at what artists did for the same kind of stuff, like dark fantasy, medieval. There's Dark Souls again. So you can look to them for inspiration and then try to transform that, or try to incorporate something of that in your own music and go from there. What I've also done is, because I'm kind of a metal artist at heart, that's kind of my background, I've also just written a piece of metal And that's how I fixed the string quartet problem I was talking about earlier. I just wrote a piece of metal, and then I just converted the entire thing to a string quartet piece.
Wow.
And it came out like pretty amazing. And so that's another way to go about it. Just go to what you know best and then convert the material from there.
That's so cool.
So there's a lot of ways. Thank you. But yeah, that's some of the approaches that you could use.
I'm amazed. That's a cool approach. Wow. Yeah. So how do you keep your voice authentic when you, like adapt your styles, as you said, for example, with the first writing something in metal and then, well, I don't know if that's the correct term, transposing it or whatever. I mean, transposing it is probably wrong. Please don't bash me on it, but...
Transcribing generally, but we'll let it slide.
Damn it.
Yes.
Yeah, so my question was, how do you keep your authentic voice when you need to adapt your style, for example, for writing for other media?
So, for example, let's say your natural style is medieval dark fantasy, which I've never heard somebody say, but sure. And let's say you get commissioned to write the next Pokemon game soundtrack. Well, how do you remain authentic to your style while still keeping it appropriate? Because frankly, I think it would be pretty weird to have a dark medieval fantasy soundtrack on a Pokemon game.
Yeah, that's going to be really weird. Well,
do you keep it authentic?
Yeah, of course, in a way, but yeah, I think as a composer for media in general, I think it's really important that you love to make music for just like a bunch of different kind of music. I mean, it's really hard there are only a few people who actually can do that. If you say like, I love to make medieval, I don't know what you said, but like medieval
dark fantasy
lute music.
Oh, yeah.
If you only make that, then you're, I mean, it can be, if you really are really strong in your niche, then maybe there's a path for you there. But in general, it's really important to, be able to make different kinds of music. But of course, there has to be some constant, authentic theme in there. And I think that's kind of different from everybody, because it really comes down to your process. And I think, as the same with development and art and all kind of other stuff, the process can vary from person to person, a lot. Yeah. I think my process of making music is way different than Nathan's process for making music. I think it's really important that in your process there has to be some element which comes back, which makes it yours, and that can be your instruments. If you play a lot of, I collect all kinds of instruments and I record them and I make all kinds of stuff of it. Sometimes you don't even hear it's that instrument anymore, but it's my sound, and that's what I do. If you have something that is yours and something that you can attach to a lot of different genres, then you can keep your authentic. That's a really difficult word for me to pronounce.
Authentic.
Authentic.
True style.
Yeah, true style. Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
When you wrote on your website that you do like mad experiments with like sounds, I was imagining you going with a recorder through the like apartment or wherever you are and just recording everything. I mean,
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
so how do you go about it? Do you really just sit there, eat an apple, and record it? Is your life?
Yeah, that's my no. I have these sessions where I just go out and record stuff. So that can be, I've always a backpack with me. There's a microphone. So that's always with me. So whenever I bump into something which is interesting, then I record it. Or sometimes I just go to the forest and record over there. Last winter I was in Switzerland and there was a beautiful foggy morning, and fog damps the sound, So you can make really nice forest recordings. So I went into the forest to record because it was the perfect circumstances for forest recordings, you know. But on the other, and that's more for sound design kind of stuff, you know. You need those forest sounds and twigs crackling, and there was even ice, so I could make ice cracks, you know. But I also had a time that I was talking to a guy, an old guy, and he was talking. We were talking a little bit about music, and he said, like, yeah, I in this other room over there, I have a whole gamelan set, you know, and that's like a traditional Indonesian setup for instruments with a lot of big bells and gongs and beautiful instruments.
They're huge, by the way.
So we went to the. It's huge. Yeah, it was like a whole room filled with instruments,
Wow.
and he took me there, and I was like, "Wow, man, this is amazing!" And I had my backpack with my microphone with me, and I recorded all those bells and gongs and whatnot. And I mean, it's not the best recording ever, but it's my recording, you know. And that's. Yeah, and so that's not really the Met Professor like experiment, maybe, but it's a way to to get authentic sounds and to then take these sounds into your workstation and experiment with it. Can you make music of it? Can you make a whole track with just one twig crackling? You know, can you make every instrument from it? That's what I find really interesting.
Cool. Now that you have mentioned the software earlier, maybe what hardware are you using? Because you just mentioned microphone, and is it important what microphone you're using even? Probably.
This is a this is I think a big debate amongst audio engineers in general. Well, I'm really like, okay, if you need, of course, a good microphone. But in my opinion, you don't need those, you know, $10,000 microphones to record your stuff. I mean, come on, for me, it's too much. But you need a good microphone, of course.
Well, there's one big thing. I don't want to interrupt you, but before we forget it,
no.
There's there's this thing where you have this recording quality, and you can set it to 48 kilohertz. Or 96 kilohertz, and it probably doesn't make a lot of sense right now if I just say that to you, but for it basically means it's basically the resolution of a sound file.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so if you have 48 kilohertz, then that's the sound of a lot of MP3s and a lot of music, and it sounds pretty good. But once you get to tinkering with the material a lot and down pitching it and shifting the times and stuff, then 48 isn't enough sometimes. So then you want to, if you record in double that resolution in 96 kilohertz, then you can those sound effects that you use in games, like footsteps or the twigs that crack, like Bas was saying, you can transform those a lot and work with them a lot, and destroy the material, but they'll still sound good. So the one thing that is pretty undebatable in sound design for games, I'd say, is that you record those the important sound effects with 96 kilohertz, so you can mess around with them and still have good sounding material.
Yeah, you can record your, if you have an iron ball, for example, you can record it on 96 kilohertz. And if you downpitch it, it can sound like a big gong, and that's nice about recording in this big resolution.
So you say good microphone. Let's say I have a new phone. Would that already go as good microphone? Because, I mean, like a lot of indie devs, for example, don't really have a super good audio equipment and just maybe want to start doing some simple sounds for, I don't know, buttons. Would a phone microphone already be all right?
Well, it depends. I mean, I know professional sound designers who also recorded some sounds with their mobile phone, and it actually made it to the game.
I didn't expect that.
No. When I actually I saw this in a how do you call that in a talk. I didn't expect that either, but he compensates that also with other sounds which are really good. So he kind of used the crappiness of the microphone of the mobile phone to get something. But I would not recommend to record your whole game by your mobile phone. It's going to be difficult to make that sound nice. Yeah. I mean, I think it's the same with game art. If you make everything in Microsoft Paint, then it's gonna do something with your game,
it's
right?
gonna look awesome.
Yes.
Well, recording on mobile phone could be an artistic choice, maybe, but
And then the paint graphics, perfect.
yes.
Yeah, of course. And then those two match perfectly, probably.
So, are there any specific models of microphone that you would recommend to somebody on a budget?
I would definitely say a Zoom microphone. So that's like the thing I think you're talking in right now, right?
Yeah, I am talking into a Zoom H2N.
Well, people, does it sound good? It's yours to decide. The nice thing about those microphones is that, especially if you want to record something for, I mean, you can get those microphones for I think under 100.
This
euros,
cost me, I think, $40, maybe $35-$40.
Oh, really?
Yeah, cheap.
Oh,
Secondhand, but
yeah. Well, wonderful. Okay, I mean, if you have that, you can. Most of them they have two microphones actually, so you can record stereo, which means that if you record something, then it plays back in both of your ears, which makes it more realistic and actually pretty good. So a lot of those Zoom recorders have the stereo output, and another thing is that it's portable. I mean, if you just have the microphone like that and you just go out into wherever you need to be to record your sounds, then you can come pretty far. You can even in your own kitchen, I think you can use all your kitchen equipment to make some really nice robots for your game. So yeah, I think I think if you're starting off with audio, that would be one of the first things to buy. Not like a really expensive microphone which you have to plug into your interface and then to your PC or whatever, and that's too much maybe if you just want to record some sounds.
yeah, that's a good point, because professional microphones often use a different input that you won't find on a computer. They often use XLR inputs, which means you need a separate interface to buy on top of the microphone, which can then plug into the PC's USB. That's why I'm using an H2N right now. It's much easier.
Yeah, exactly. You need, and a lot of microphones, they also need a phantom power. So that's 48 volt power to get some tension on the membrane of the microphone. So they actually need to be amplified in a way, the microphones itself, which makes it more delicate to work with, and also, less attractive to take with you if you go out, and needs, sometimes some things you just cannot take to the studio with you.
You mentioned earlier, if you have access to a kitchen and you've got a microphone, you can make some quite cool sounds for your game. Now, a lot of sound designers have some favorite sound sources or tricks. It's a slightly generic question, but for example, I heard that some of the laser sounds in Star Wars were made using a slinky. Those metal coils. Yes. They just stretched one out and hit it, and it made those pew laser sounds. Yeah. Do you have any fun kind of things that you like to record?
Well, I like tuned metal a lot, personally. So whenever I see a piece of metal or like a railing of stairs, I always knock on it one time just to hear how it sounds. And sometimes you find these hidden gems. So yeah, and what I like the most is actually if you have a bicycle and you turn it upside down, and you take the from a violin. Oh man, how you call
Strings?
this?
Spokes on the wheel.
The bow.
Oh, bow. Yeah, sorry.
No, you have the bow. Yeah, the bow of a violin, and you put it on the spokes. Then you get this really intense horror sounds. Actually, yeah, you can turn the wheel, and it makes this really, really intense metallic horror sound, and I love it. It's amazing. I like that so much, and I love cycling as well. So for me, it's two worlds coming together.
Cycling with a violin.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, and really creepy for a lot of people. Probably.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Another question I have, and I've got personal interest in this because I've always asked myself this question if I'm doing any sound for a game. How realistic do you keep the sound source for these sounds that you're making in the game? For example, if we want the sound of a heartbeat, do you put a microphone to your chest and try to get your heart there? Or maybe do you go into a TB-808 and take a drum sound there and just muffle it a bit? So that's like, how realistic do you keep your sounds, or do you go for an exaggerated version?
It really depends on the game and on the style, actually, I think. I mean, this is something you normally talk through. This has something to do with style of the game and of the project you're working on. So this is something you have to talk through with the people you're working with. Often, for example, there are a lot of sounds which are added, which are normally not in the real world. So a really famous and good example is, for example, forests. They, in a lot of games and also a lot of, especially movies, they crack and there's so much sound, you know, in movies and games with forests. But normally, you know, forests, they don't crack normally. But for some reason, your mind makes this connection like, oh yeah, this cracking sound of like trees bending in the wind, you know, this fits right, you know, like a low cracking sound. But normally trees are actually a high-pitched cracking. They are like peeping, actually, if they are in the wind. So these kind of things, you know, this is one example, but the other one is, for example, if you hit somebody, I don't know if you hit somebody, then it doesn't make a really intense sound.
Yeah, that's kind of...
Yes, Edwin, explain.
Well, I've had a long career of just hitting people, so...
This is a more high-pitched ouch.
A lot of pub fights came to this conclusion. But you know, in games, if you don't hear anything when you punch somebody, it feels really disappointing, right? Yeah. You want to hear that nice pew, pew, and whatnot. So you add a lot of stuff which isn't there to make it more realistic. Ironically.
That brings us to another question we wanted to ask today, which is, how do you find the right sound for a particular game? You've talked about the sound design side of things. How about the right music? And how much of that process comes from you as the sound people? And how much do you think comes from, is the game developer's responsibility in communicating to you?
Oh, yeah. Well, a lot of it... has to do with, you know, you always carry your own style with you, so it, in my opinion, it shouldn't be too far from what you do. But except for that, there's kind of two sides, because you say how much of it is yours and how much of it is the team. And usually when you join a project, they already had something in mind. So maybe they've worked with a temp track, something that is like, I should call it a placeholder music, that might be more general. And that's usually etched into their minds a lot. So that might make it hard to find a style for a game, you know, if there's already something existing that is kind of etched into their minds. So that always kind of plays a role in what you make, because in my case, I make sketches, and then I check with the team, you know, do you like this? And if they don't, then it's like, maybe no, okay, it needs to be a bit more like this track maybe. And then usually you kind of kind of wriggle and form towards something that that becomes something that you both agree on, and then that's your style. And that, yeah, well, that's kind of the process I usually had. I'm not sure if Boss maybe has another view on that, but
No, I think it's quite similar. You always get a placeholder, and you make sketches, and I mean, a really big part of this is communication, and a big part of that is, I think, the same as with art. Actually, you have to translate your professional language to, the human language of the people you're working with. I mean, people have to understand. If I'm talking way too technical about something, then people are not going to understand it. You have to translate it to something which people can connect with, and often that's actually with colors and or even objects.
Oh.
So this sounds too warm, or I feel can it be? People can actually say something like, can it be more, more gray, something like that, more dark. Yeah, they often express sound with colors. Or
when would you say would be the best time to introduce sound into the pipeline of development? Whether towards the end, or to have a better feeling, maybe rather towards the beginning of the development phase of a game?
Well, personally, I'd say immediately. Like, there might not be a lot of people that, or a lot of sound designers or composers that want to be integrated into this entire process. But I think it's pretty important, because if you don't start soon, or don't start, early on with sound, you can't playtest on it. You can't iterate on what you make. So I think it's for that reason alone, because music for games, or sound for games, or technical sound design for games especially, is a very iterative process as well. So there's no reason not to start having sounds in the game early.
For example, if the game itself is still in a conceptual phase, where there's still concept art being made, how much would, for example, concept art help you find a specific sound or feeling for your music?
Personally, I use it a lot to have emotions conveyed to me, so I can convey them in the music. And it's like, you say concept art, so there's no final assets for the game yet, so the music isn't gonna be either. It can be sketches, or like, it's not a finished piece of music.
Because what I get from that is that you say that you would start the concepting of the music at the same time as concepting the art.
I personally don't see a reason why not. Like, obviously for the sound people, there's not as much work, but there's no reason that they shouldn't be introduced early, so they can make a sketch that can be iterated upon. Because if you join too late, and the first 5 sketches aren't good, and you're running out of time, then it's like, okay, so are we gonna go with something that's maybe not what we want, but is closest to what we want? Like, that's not how you treat other aspects of the game usually. So I don't see a reason why sound shouldn't be part of that process as well.
And I think it's also really nice to get this, especially between the art department and the music, I think, and sound.
Yeah.
To get this going back and forth between those two, if you make some art, for example, and I can make some music of it, maybe you get another idea of it and you can take inspiration from it. So, and in the end, I really believe that helps to connect all those things together and make it one thing.
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me, that it's awesome if one department can get inspired by what the other person or the other department does.
Yeah, exactly.
Nonetheless, and this is just by the by, I was reading about Jeremy Soule probably half a year ago, but he's a game music composer I'm quite keen on. I think he doesn't just do game music, but he did the Guild Wars soundtracks. And for the first of the Guild Wars games, it sounds like he was just given concept art. And he made the final soundtrack from that, if I've got the correct idea from what he said about the process. I found that so weird because the soundtrack fits really nicely to the game. But it's like I do wonder what could he have done if he was more integrated into the process of making the game. Yeah, it's a weird one.
It might also be, I'm not sure, I haven't watched or read anything about it, but it could also be like Boss's example of Austin Wintory and Journey, that if he made it early, then maybe the game also got inspired by the soundtrack a bit. I'm not sure if that's the way it went, but that might be a reason why it fits so well.
It's nice to imagine that the music had so much influence.
at the very least,
yeah.
it is,
Yeah.
In a perfect way.
Exactly. Well, moving on from that then, we've touched on the subject of adaptive audio earlier, but let's get into the specifics. So, in what ways do you think audio should adapt to a game? It's a broad question, but yeah.
I think that this really depends also on what kind of game you have. I mean, if you have a really story-driven game, then I think it's really important to make it really adaptive, so that you follow the things that are happening within the soundtrack, within the sound design is kind of adaptive on itself, actually, because that's what sound design is in a lot of ways. But for the music, if it's a really story-driven game, then it's really important to make it interactive, I think, because then you're trying to go with the emotional flow of the game in a way. But you have also games where which are way more focused on that you get good at a certain aspect of the game, of course, or a lot of big open world RPG games where you just have to wander around, and then it's not so important to make it adaptive. So I would say it really depends on the game and what you do. I don't know if you think different about this, Nathan.
I think, I agree. But I think a good question to ask is, what kind of experience do you want? And try to make the music adaptive from there. Because if like Boss said earlier, like there are some games that don't have that much interactivity. Say you're playing like Super Smash Bros. You don't want an interactive soundtrack that follows every move you do, or well, maybe you do, but if you're playing Smash Bros with friends, you probably just want some hype and some adrenaline. So you just pick the stage and have some hype track play, and that's part of the design. And I think there's not a lot of interactive music needed there. But if your design is okay, I have this really story-driven game, and I want the player to experience a lot of emotion, and then you probably want the music to underline emotional events happening, and in that case you need to make sure that your music is like designed in a way so that it can play those certain emotional parts at the moments that you want them played. So I think it's really a matter of what kind of game you want to make, and like what kind of design you have, and then make a interactive music system design thing based on that. I think that's the way to go.
Do you have any particular tricks that make whatever audio you produce as easy as possible for the game developer to then just use straight away in their game?
Well, I'd say the trick is probably communication. Because if you're talking about making it easy for game developers to use, then I usually ask, like, what am I allowed to do? Because like we said before, with Sinusaur we do implementation as well. So it all depends. If the programmer or if the game development team that we're working with likes to do everything themselves, then that's something we take into account when making the music. Because if we don't get any access to, let's say, Unity or third-party tools, like Fmod or Wise, then the interactivity is limited, of course, because you can't play around with it too much, and usually you design a system for something like that that's like not hard to implement. So let's take the Smash Bros example. You would probably have some looping soundtracks that can cut it at any time and then transition to something new, and you just deliver it and say, okay, this needs a fade there, and then that's probably good enough. But if you want something really interactive, then it's really useful to be able to do some things yourself in the middleware. With some projects we get like the Wise or I mean the Unity build to what's the word, play around with, and then we just hook up Wise or Fmod, and then we go wild and we'll see what we can do. And from there we make something and discuss how we're going to implement it with the game developer. So it's really depending on how much control we have over the interactivity, based on what tools we can use. Can we enter the build? Can we not enter the build? Is everything done in the game engine without middleware or with middleware? Who implements it? I think it's all pretty important and all feeds into that question you had.
Yeah, very nice. I've personally been noticing in some royalty-free libraries fairly, I'll admit, unsuccessful attempts to have a slider where you can just change the intensity level of the music. So in these royalty-free libraries, the music's been written in 2 or 3, 4, 5 maybe layers, and these sliders affect the volumes of each of these separate layers, and the layers are designed to sound good with each other at any one time. I'm not going to lie, I wasn't very convinced. I've written vertically layering soundtracks before, but I thought that approach of trying to do a one-size-fits-all looked quite limited. It seemed to be trying to do something too specific for what is meant to be a generic product. But do you have any great ideas for how perhaps a royalty-free library for any composers here who may be trying to build their own might want to address that? I guess for a royalty-free library, it's a problem of adaptability for game music.
Yeah, I can think something about it, because for my graduation I focused on this for my graduation, to create a royalty-free library which could be interactive. So, and not in a way that you just add layers, but actually in a way that you change between sections within music based on parameters or sliders. You mean that if you want to make such a library, what would be a good tip? I say that a good advice?
Well, it seems your way around the issue has been, rather than composing with layers, to I think it's referred to as horizontal composing, where you move from one bit to another. Did you find that worked better?
Well, you can take it down to 3 basic elements in which you can write interactive music. One of them is horizontal resequencing. That's where you talk about. Is that if you that you change between different sections within the music based on a parameter. The other one is vertical reorchestration, and that's the bringing in the layers, according to a certain parameter. And the other one is stingers, which is used a lot in, for example, horror. When something's happening, then it has to happen on that moment, and it has to fit in the music, for example. So if you combine those 3 techniques, and then you can come pretty far, actually. Another thing to add on top of that is to change. It really depends on the music, but to change certain aspects of the music with effect chains, which you can connect also to parameters. So
can you maybe repeat the 3 methods you just mentioned, just for the people who are, well, not so deep into audio and music design?
Yeah. So if everybody's ready to take notes, you have vertical reorchestration. That's adding layers. Horizontal resequencing, which is jumping between sections within the music with a parameter. And stingers, which are taking place on one specific moment, which are more like events within the music to tip something. And last but not least, changing the effect chain of within the music. For example, distortion or reverb sounds, which you can modulate according to certain parameters.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very cool. I haven't seen effect chains being explored that much in royalty-free libraries, but that would be really cool to see some more of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I add something to Boss's story?
Yeah.
It's not to shill myself, but when I had to graduate, I also wrote something on when to use different interactive ways of making music, and for what situation would be appropriate. So if everyone listening wants that, we could link a resource to that paper, because it might help some people.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah, we'll put a link in the description.
That would be awesome. I mean, we covered so many topics by now, but we still have like very few questions about, well, we know that both of you do freelance work, and it's mostly geared towards new sound designers who want to also start freelancing. So how do you start? How do you get gigs? Do you have any recommendations or suggestions, advice?
Yes, I mean, honestly, we are also. I mean, we are also getting just getting into the industry. So we are also exploring how we get our foot on the ground in the industry. That being said, what I noticed is that the most useful projects are the projects where you actually, met people and talked with somebody and get to know somebody, and you have to connect you have to be really comfortable with the people you're working with. So you have to have been able to talk to somebody and not only spoke with text through Discord, for example. That's going to make it really tough to get to know some really nice people to rely on and to get in projects with. So
you're saying making friends in the industry.
Just go some places, to go to events and meet new people there. We go to here in Utrecht. You have every month you have a game lunch with a lot of people from the industry. Just go there every month and into such events and meet people and don't push what you want in their face. Like, I want to make music for your game or whatever. But just to try to get to know people. I think that's really important.
Generally be interested in everyone, because you don't want to work with a stranger. You just want to work with a cool guy, and not with someone who just pushes himself like, I want to make music. Let me make your music. So that being said, though, besides networking, there's obviously a lot of things going on online. So I've had some experience with that, because I've tried Discord projects. Jackie, you know of it. But yeah, there's a lot of passion projects going around on Discord and like other online places. But what I want to say for that is, don't bet on one horse, because there's a lot of projects that don't finish or go stale, and people just don't get motivated anymore, and they don't work on it. Maybe because they just don't feel like it, or they have a really time-consuming job, because sometimes it's passion projects and people don't have the energy to work on games after work. So if you do Discord projects, just don't bet on one horse and then get burned out because your team isn't working. Just do a little bit for everything. Like if you have like a couple of projects that you accept, just make a couple of sketches for sound design and music for some. And then if you notice one of them is picking up and actually getting stuff done, then you can do more than a couple of sketches. But don't, go ham on every project, because not every project is guaranteed to work. And also, while we're on that topic, don't be afraid to put stuff on your portfolio that isn't completely finished. Because if you have a snippet of good sound design or just a little bit of a map that you provided with sounds or music, and it sounds good, but it is an entire game, don't be afraid to put that on a reel somewhere. Because, it sounds good, it works. People aren't going to check your entire game and play it for an hour. Sometimes they just want to see a couple of snippets. So, yeah, don't be afraid to just use that as well.
Yeah, that's very good advice. I'd add on the Discord project front, try to learn what type of game is more difficult to make and weigh that against the experience levels of the team. So,
I think there are in general like some red flags disregarding of where you get to know the people. If you realize the scope is way out of proportion for the size of the team, if okay, there is no idea about funding, or that hasn't even been a topic. All these things are probably things you learn as a freelancer over time, that you are vetting your clients or vetting the teams you're working with to find that one team, or to find the 2 or 3 teams that you think like, okay, these people are capable of finishing a game.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Do you find that you are marketing yourself in a specific kind of way? I guess it's a problem for people who are more general, who have more general talents, but do you specifically market yourself more for sound design, for example, or do you try to go for a particular mood on your web pages? And how did you go about deciding, what that image is, if you do?
At the moment, for example, our website is not looking that good. So I think it's really important to ask yourself why. What is something that I add? Besides making, for example, just a nice track. So what is something special about what I do? So we talked also about this, of course, with the 3 of us within Sinusaur. And we noticed that we have all different kind of skills and that we can take care of the whole audio process. And in that way, we can make it more like one coherent audio experience within a game. So by taking care of all the aspects of the audio chain, so the sound design, the implementation, the composition, from one team, which actually can physically sit together, in the studio, you can create a really coherent piece. And that was something that we noticed, like, okay, that is something that, we can sell to the people out there. So, but that can also be something totally different. So if you think about what makes you special, then you can also express that to the other people. If it comes to to getting online and a website, we're not active really on Instagram, for example, and so
we're going to be,
and we should actually.
We're going to be.
We're going to be. Yeah, we should be way better at that. Yeah, and that's something. Do as I say and not as I do. Be really active on Instagram. No, I don't know. We are not really good in marketing ourselves online at this moment. We are really working on that.
Yeah. So
it's a constant struggle.
Let's say people listening to this podcast would want to hire you. Where or how can they reach you guys?
www.sinusaur.com.
Awesome.
Nice. Look them up.
That's great.
Yeah. Yes.
Also about standing out and a generalist thing, like it might not be such it might not be too relevant, but I know it's kind of anecdotal, but there's this game called VVVVV, and it's made by damn, I forgot the name, but there's a guy that composed for that, but his music style is kind of like it's kind of niche, and not a lot of games want that. But that game, that VVVVV, like they picked up on him and they were like, okay, your niche is somehow perfect for what we want to do. And suddenly that guy, his career picked up and the game took off, and suddenly he made it. So it's more to say, if you're like super into a niche, don't forego that you're super into that niche, because it might be your biggest strength. So it may be in contrast to the generalist thing. If you're kind of niche and you're thinking about going full generalist, at least play into your strengths by exploring that niche and applying it to things, because that's what makes you special. So, if you think you're a generalist, then maybe think about something that you always do that maybe doesn't like apply to everyone else, because that might be your biggest strength.
Maybe you're the only person whose sound design software crashes every 2 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah, who knows?
That's not a specific example at all.
Actually, there's
going to be a really weird talk if somebody tries to sell you that. Hey, what I have? I have software that crashes every 2 minutes.
There's actually a small anecdotal thing also for this one I have, because I got told by one of my tutors at the Masters that there was this guy, and he used a trial version of Fruity Loops, which is a DAW as well, a digital audio workstation. And his Fruity Loops would shut down after a certain amount of time, like 1 day or 2 days. But he would always use it. Like, his self-imposed restriction was that his software would stop working after some time. And based on that, he tried to make everything within that time, and it affected his output a lot.
Wow.
So, in the most weird, bizarre way, that restriction gave a certain sound or a certain aesthetic to the things he did. So, the thing you said about the software crashing isn't even that crazy.
Yeah, that's actually wonderful.
That's so cool.
Just with trial versions.
Funny you mentioned that, because literally maybe 3 or 4 days ago, I looked up the soundtrack to Lisa, Lisa, another indie game, and apparently I think that was a solo dev. But the main guy behind the game at least, also made the soundtrack, and I read on some of the YouTube comments, he made it in the trial version of Fruity Loops, which is looks like that's a pretty good way to go.
Yeah, there you have it.
Okay.
So
you can choose different styles in it. I know that some workstations you can only open it once, and then you have to, in the trial version, and then you have to keep on working and finish it in one row.
Wow.
That's also I heard also somebody who did that. So that's also he just went on working on a song, worked for, let's say, 15 hours straight, and then had to finish it because you couldn't save it.
I think those limitations can be very helpful for any artist. It can be quite difficult to draw an endpoint and just say, this is done now, I can't improve it further.
Yeah, you have these drawing challenges actually a lot, where you say, okay, you have a 5-minute drawing, for example, to draw a person, and after 5 minutes you're done. And the results,
nice.
You will notice really quickly how far you improve in these 5 minutes to get the drawing of a person. And the more you do it, the quicker you will improve and see what way. It changes your approach, because you see, for example, to stay with the person, you see the person more as a whole, instead of first you just started with the head and then you detailed out the head, but after 5 minutes you notice, I'm missing the rest of the body.
Yeah. I'm sure some people would disagree with me, but with a lot of art, it can be a very slow process. But I think the slowness can actually get in the way of creativity.
Oh,
So
yeah, definitely.
I'm always happy to find ways, even if it's just shortcuts in my DAW, to make that process much faster so that the idea in my head can go to the computer in a minute less or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
It's funny you say that because I'm actually I totally agree with it. Your computer has to feel like your brush, or in my case, like my instrument. And there are definitely people out there who oppose that, who said no, you have to sit on a rock and think for 5 hours and then start writing your music. But for me, it has to be exactly what you say. It has to be intuitive, It has to be an extension of yourself and the tools where you're working with.
For any solo devs, we've touched on the topic already, who are making the sounds for their game, perhaps we can offer some advice to them. So, for example, is there any software you'd recommend for them to use?
Well, I have one, and that's a really cheap DAW to use is Reaper. Well, I still use it. It's what I started in, and it stuck with me. But it's very accessible. Like the trial also lasts a long time, so you can just pick it up and start doing stuff with it. It's very light, and it has some basic plugins. Like they're not the greatest, but they get you into doing things. So if you want to get started, just start with Reaper, and if it's not to your liking, you can go from there and look for other DAWs. But stuff like Cubase, Pro Tools, Logic, that's usually a bit more expensive, so you might want to try Reaper before you switch to those.
I see quite a few people starting out using Fruity Loops, which has already been mentioned. It's got this famous, or should I say notorious, trial version that it's got quite a lot of instruments already included with it. So a lot of DAWs do come with certain instruments and maybe effect plugins that can be very useful. How about you, Bas?
I'm going to take a little bit, because I agree with Nathan about Reaper, and that's just if you want to make a nice soundtrack for your game, if you're just starting out. I'm going to take a little bit of a different turn here, because this is also maybe interesting if you're more technical, if you like a more technical approach. You have this software which is called Pure Data. And I haven't worked, actually I worked with it a lot, but not for games. But I know that this software, it's a programming language basically, which is, I don't know how you call it in English, but it's really visual, the same way as Unreal Engine is working with the
blueprints. Yeah,
the blueprints, yes. And you can download different modules of this blueprints and connect them and make music with it and make it interactive. And the fun thing about this is it can also be used as middleware. So you can create your music in there and at the same time use it as middleware. And if you're more technical about, if you're for example a developer, a programmer, and you have to make the sounds and you want to get a little bit technical, but also easy, then dive into it.
That's
into Pure Data.
That's a really cool recommendation. Is it free to use?
Yeah, it's open source.
Cool.
Nice.
Yes.
Do you think that that somebody, a game dev who wants to make his own music, should get some training in music, or do you recommend they just dive straight in?
I would recommend. There's this really cool Udemy course. I think it lasts for like 10 hours, which basically takes you from the beginning of how you even write music to how you implement it in your game engine. And they often have this sales where you can buy this course for like 10 euros or 11 euros or something like this. So it doesn't, if you do something like that, it makes it way more easy.
Yeah, I would say for something that you can't see, the basic principles behind music can be surprisingly easy. Like with anything, it can get as advanced as you want it to. But the basics can be fairly straightforward. So you might want to just look up a course.
Yeah. Everything is easy until it becomes difficult.
Well said.
Yeah, exactly. Those are wise words.
Thank you.
I wanted to add to the software thing we were talking about real quick, just to throw it out there. But use Fmod. It's cheap if you have a low budget, and it's free if you never, or if you have a low budget and if you only do a certain amount of projects a year. But to get yourself started with interactive music, just use that. It might look scary and technical, but Boss is following a really comprehensive course on that right now. So you can use that course as well, or you can just start doing things because it's formed like a DAW. So if you're already into music, it's quite how do you say that?
Intuitive?
Intuitive, yes, thank you. So pick it up because it's a pretty important tool in making your audio interactive. So yeah, it's easy to pick up. So yeah, do it.
Well, nice. Cool. Is there anything we haven't covered today that either you, Nathan, or Boss would want to mention?
No, but I want to say that we are. I will be this month on Res, if I say it correctly, in London. Res. So
that would be in March 2020.
Yeah. In London,
right?
Yes, March.
In London.
Yeah, in London.
I'll be there too. Find us.
Yeah, would be lovely. Yeah, so we will be there, and maybe in Berlin as well at Maze in April, the end of April.
Yeah. Awesome. So people can come up to you and meet you and be like, "Hey,
oh my God, you're the celebrity from the Dark Paradigm Games podcast."
Yeah. Exactly. That would be amazing if that happens.
It would be awesome. Yeah.
Like the 5 people who listen to it all go to Res.
No,
500.
So.
Excuse me.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think we've covered all the topics we wanted to talk about today. Thank you so much for joining us as our first guests. And where can people find you guys? Just to repeat it again.
This time is for you, Nathan.
www.sinusaur.com.
Awesome. So thank you for joining us. Thank you guys for listening and sticking with us. If you enjoyed our podcast, please join our Discord server and we will keep you posted for our next podcast. The link is in the description. We also will link Nathan's article, and join us about the same time next month in March 2020. Thank you so much. I was your host, I am Jackie Martin, and I was joined by Edwin Deiser. Thank you.